In 1905, a Chinese student studying abroad in Japan witnessed an act of violence that would change his life and the landscape of Chinese literature as a whole. Lu Shun, who was initially pursuing medicine in order to help his fellow countrymen, switched to being a writer after seeing a film where a Chinese man was being tied up by Japanese troops for decapitation as Chinese onlookers came to watch the spectacle. Witnessing the death of a compatriot with an audience of apathetic Chinese spectators amidst a crowd of cheering Japanese no doubt left a deep psychological scar on him. Indeed, Lu Shun would carry this traumatic experience with him for years, revisiting it in the stories he wrote through depictions of violence, cannibalism, and the gaze of apathetic onlookers, all while he rose to become one of the leading figures of modern Chinese literature. As Michael Berry puts it, the formation of modern Chinese literature began with an image of violence, a trauma on which rests a multitude of questions concerning memory, modernity, and representations of violence. Today, I would like to talk about Lu Shun's lasting legacy of violence in modern Chinese literature. More specifically, how does the theme of violence permeate Chinese media in the modern age? Why is the violence included? And what is it trying to say? Across several sources I've looked into, I've found that the violence that appears in them can be broadly characterized into three categories. Violence enacted by victims of violence, that is to say, victims of violence who become the perpetrators, violence against women, and violence as an exploration of Chinese identity. Each of these forms of violence says something about the state of China at the time they were written, but what they say varies across each work. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. You are my sunshine. A Touch of Sin, released in 2013, is a movie directed by Jia Zhangke and follows 4 loosely connected stories, all violent in some way. I'd like to focus on 2 of the stories, both of which focus on violence that is born out of a desire to retaliate. Almost 500 years earlier, a novel with a similar sense of vigilante-esque justice was written. I am, of course, referring to The Water Margin, a classic text attributed to Shi Nai'an from the Yuan dynasty. It follows the heroes of Mount Liang on their journey from being civilians and officials to outlaws after getting screwed over by the corrupt state. Jia Zhangke very clearly takes inspiration from these stories in his own work, even referencing Lin Chong in Da Hai's segment, as we can view Da Hai and Xiao Yu as heroes characteristic of the Brothers of the Marsh. Da Hai witnesses his village remain in poverty as corrupt officials get richer, and lashes out on a killing spree when all his efforts to report his grievances fail. There is a sense of cathartic release in Da Hai's violence, like the viewer can channel their rage through him. While the premise behind Xiao Yu's story is different from Da Hai's, they share some core themes, that being lashing out against people who abuse their power against the weak. Xiao Yu stabs and kills a man after he persistently harassed her for sexual favors despite her consistent rejections of his advances. Xiao Yu's story speaks to a harsh reality that many women live through. Women, especially working-class women, are expected to bear the abuse they receive from their male superiors. Much like the heroes of Mount Liang, Da Hai and Xiao Yu both feel the need to take matters into their own hands when the higher powers they should be able to rely on fail them. Drawing on the traditional heroism of The Water Margin, Jia portrays violence as a justified response to oppression. It is important to note that A Touch of Sin is not intended as a national allegory. Instead, it zooms in on certain individuals left behind by China's rapid modernization. Rather than characters like Da Hai and Xiao Yu representing China as a whole, it's more reasonable to think of them as representatives of victims of this present time. Of course, things in China around 2013 are pretty great, at least in the economic aspect. It saw sustained urbanization and economic development. Think China's rise as a global superpower. However, things on the human rights front are not looking too great. Da Hai and Xiao Yu's stories serve as a reminder and warning towards those in power and everyone's neighbors. Bystanders can catch strays too. Mao always said that violence is a necessary part of revolution and that casualties are unavoidable. But this raises the question, is the violence displayed in these instances revolutionary? While the violence may not be immediately revolutionary, the flames of revolution are born from the embers of retaliation and resistance. The reality is that it is difficult to change the inherent violence of the status quo. There are layers of macro and micro violence happening on the social and individual level, all mirroring each other. Just as the PRC and CCP's revolutionary change to make China rich is enacting violence, so too is the, quote, revolutionary violence being enacted by individuals like Da Hai and Xiao Yu, all at a cost. When the violence imposed by the status quo becomes too much to bear, people are bound to lash out. If the violence is so built into the system, how could we possibly put an end to it? I'm not really a political expert, so I can't really answer this question. But looking at China today, can we at least say that there's been an improvement? Well, the economic domination is still dominating, and it seems like there's been more civilians fighting for social causes like women's rights, but the government is definitely not prioritizing those issues. Thus, the violence present in A Touch of Sin might be relevant for some more time. Xiaoyu's story definitely counts as a case of violence against women, so let's continue on this theme. First, we look to the 2007 film Lust Caution, directed by Ang Lee and based off of Eileen Chang's 1979 novella of the same name. Set during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the movie follows Wang Jiazhi, a college student who agrees to participate in a KMT-affiliated spy mission to take out Japanese collaborator Mr. Yi. Despite lacking any proper training and her being ordinary civilian, she's tasked with seducing him so he can be assassinated, resigning any autonomy she has over the situation until the very end of the film. Indeed, time and time again, we see Jiazhi put herself in sexually compromising situations for the sake of the mission. Her first sexual encounter with Mr. Yi is borderline rape, and even though Jiazhi comes to enjoy their intimate time together as the relationship progresses, if we contextualize her actions with her ultimate goal and the true nature of her relationship with Mr. Yi in mind, that of a spy and her target, it becomes difficult to claim her assertiveness as agency. The pressure of the situation builds until, not unexpectedly, she snaps, telling Mr. Yi to flee at the critical moment when the plan is about to come to fruition. Whether the decision was made consciously as an effort to regain her autonomy, or made in a moment of extreme emotion, the reality is that she betrays everyone she knows. Thus, her reclaiming her agency, if she even did at all, comes at the expense of her and all those around her. We can't help but see this ending as Chang's way of condemning patriotism. Indeed, Jiazhi plays the role of a female soldier in China's fight against Japan, exposing the exploitation of women and individuals in the name of nationalism. Chang pushes the idea that individualism should take precedence over nationalism, contrary to China's traditional Confucian values. Selfless sacrifice can only end in tragedy, as seen in Jiazhi's story. We can also look at the story of another female soldier, this time on the communist rather than nationalist side. When I Was in Xia Village was written in 1941 by Ding Ling, a female author actively involved in literary circles connected to the Chinese Communist Party. Ding Ling was a communist and a feminist. While she wrote in support of the communist cause, she also never stopped advocating for women's rights, writing about the oppression women had to confront even in the revolutionary community. Juggling both tasks was not easy, as evidenced by her being expelled from the party in 1955. When I Was in Xia Village tells the story of a woman, Zhen Zhen, who returns to her village in the rural countryside after serving the party as a spy while infiltrating the Japanese army as a prostitute. Despite her heroic service and sacrifice, many of the villagers' reactions to her return are mostly negative, as they look at her with disdain for contracting an STI and violating sexual chastity, showcasing the more backwards, conservative thinking present in rural villages in China at the time. But Zhen Zhen does not let her experiences nor other people's imposed ideals affect her. She defines her own story. Forsaking her family and arranged marriage, she believes that going to Yan'an to get treatment for her disease and support the revolutionary cause is her next best step, saying that, quote, "After I go to Yan'an, I'll be in a new situation. I will be able to start life fresh." Indeed, Ding Ling emphasizes the fact that women in Yan'an did have it much better than women who were living in the countryside. She shows the contradictory nature of the party's rhetoric on women's liberation, despite exploiting their bodies in the name of the cause, while simultaneously consolidating these ideals in Zhen Zhen's departure to Yan'an in hopes of a better future, balancing critique on the CCP's treatment of women with the endorsement of the party as the correct way to move forward. While Jiazhi and Zhen Zhen are in similar circumstances, they both fulfill the role of a female soldier, a sex spy to be specific. The messages their stories present could not be more different. Jiazhi's story represents the consequences of sacrificing the individual for the sake of a greater cause, while Zhen Zhen's story adopts a critical lens on the issue of women's rights as it pertains to the Chinese Communist Revolution, as well as rural countrysides that are still stuck in feudal China. On both sides of the issue, women can be victimized, but unlike Jiazhi, who doesn't have a happy ending at all, Zhen Zhen finds her happy ending in Yan'an in support of the communist cause. It is here that the difference in motives of Eileen Chang and Ding Ling is made clear. Yet, despite this, the violence against women messaging is largely the same in both works, speaking to the universality of this experience on both sides of the pond. Moving away from more wartime-centric themes, we turn to depictions of violence that critique the Chinese condition. Lu Shun's story, A Madman's Diary, was published in 1918. Across several diary entries, we gain insight into the thoughts of a man afflicted with madness, specifically the kind that makes him prone to thinking his family, the villagers, and everyone around him is a cannibal out to eat him. In general, the story encourages a break from feudal Chinese society, labeling those who conform to such a system as cannibals. This is made clear in its blatant criticism of Ruism, the benchmark for Chinese moral and social obligation. When the narrator tries to read a book, he finds that, quote, scrawled all over each page are the words virtue and morality. Since I could not sleep anyway, I read intently half the night until I began to see words between the lines, the whole book being filled with the two words eat people. While not explicitly stated, the words virtue and morality scrawled all over each page are well-known principles of Confucianism, pointing to the presence of cannibalism in the Confucian classics. If we recall Lu Shun's author origin story, his scathing critique of such traditional Chinese customs is not unfounded. Because Ruism is at the center of Chinese values, it, among the other Chinese feudal practices, can be attributed to Lu Shun's crash out over the execution he witnessed back in Japan. It is precisely the thing that prompted him to abandon medicine in favor of the pen in order to rehabilitate the backwardness he perceived in the Chinese people. In the story, cannibalism mirrors the oppressive nature of Chinese feudal society, and in depicting such a visceral topic as the truth, Lu Shun toes the line between sanity and madness. Is the madman the only sane one because he has seen through and freed himself from the oppression of outdated Chinese customs to which the others conform? Or are we overthinking things and should just take his insanity at face value? This distinction becomes ambiguous, drawing into question the validity of the Chinese identity at the time, especially as it pertains to feudalism. We now move a bit forward in time to when postmodernism sees a rise in China. Yu Hua's avant-garde novella, One Kind of Reality, published in 1986, sees some similarities to Lu Shun's The True Story of A.Q., which is not surprising because Yu Hua basically acknowledges Lu Shun as his spiritual father. The novella follows the tragedy of a family as it falls apart through repeated acts of violence. Despite this, the family seems to have a general detachment from everything, including the violence that is happening. There is a sense of distortion of reality as the characters are, in a sense, mentally removed from the grotesque events that threaten their family. What is particularly striking is the way Yu Hua treats the family dynamic. Rather than follow the proper virtuous and moral norms as dictated by Confucianism, the chain attacks of violence that befall the family and their oddly displaced reactions deprive them of any sense of ethicality or normality one would expect to govern a typical Chinese family. And the clincher is that no one is to blame but the family themselves. As such, similarities can be read between Diary of a Madman and One Kind of Reality, particularly the critiques and complete disregard for adhering to Confucian customs. One Kind of Reality in particular, in all its postmodern glory, points to a discourse as critical to the core of Chinese national identity as the unity of family. And family problems are not the only subjects of Yu Hua's allegory. Individual identity is attacked too. Shangang in particular parallels A.Q., especially in the execution scene in the end, the difference being Shangang seems completely unaware of the reality he's being subjected to. Much like the rest of the story, Shangang's mind seems a million miles away. He's more concerned about the novelty of standing in a position he had only witnessed others be in before. Unlike A.Q., who feels the eyes of the spectators to his execution biting into his soul and unable to swallow his pride and yell for help, Shangang is made a total and utter laughingstock by those present at his execution. Absolutely terrified, he rolled back onto his feet. Looking at the people around him, he cried, "Am I dead yet?" No one answered him. Everyone was roaring with laughter. The connections to A.Q. already point to a critique on the Chinese individual, seeing as A.Q.'s original purpose was a diagnostic test for those impeding on China's progress. But Shangang's lack of self takes this idea a step further and repurposes it for the era Yu Hua is writing in, that of post-Mao China. The ironic fact is that at the end, when Shangang's body is being taken apart in an extreme display of visual violence, this act of viscerality is presented not as violence, but as people merely doing their jobs. As such, One Kind of Reality can be read as a journey to complete disintegration of the Chinese individual, from the dissolution of a family, to the dissolving of any character's sense of self, to the physical death of the individual, and lastly to the literal dehumanization and deconstruction of the body. As such, both Lu Shun and Yu Hua employ violence as a means to dissect Chinese identity, from questioning traditional feudal customs and Confucian propriety to the actual Chinese individual's sense of self, or lack thereof. After all this discussion, a natural question that arises is that of the efficacy of the violence in these works. Is it necessary? Why choose violence as the allegorical centerpiece or the medium of catharsis? I think part of the reason is because violence is guttural and difficult to miss, so the messaging slaps you right in the face. Violence breaks down the invulnerability of the viewer and makes them more susceptible to the messages the media is trying to convey, drawing out the more primal, instinctive emotions of the audience. In the case of Xiaoyu, Jiazhi, and Zhenzhen, the sexual violence they experience is a glimpse into the brutal reality that many women had and still have to endure. And by including it in the works, the viewer is also subjected to these horrors. Additionally, China's history of revolution and war in general can't exactly be viewed as amicable. Violence is built into its history, and China's revolutionary tradition stands strong, as is reflected in the water margin and, by extension, a touch of sin. The violence can be fan-servicey, as is the case with Dahai and Xiaoyu's vengeance, or diabolically visceral, as portrayed in One Kind of Reality. From Lu Xun's perspective over 100 years ago, penning violence was his way of processing his trauma and healing his nation, and his legacy has clearly been inherited by the artists that came after him, incorporating violence into their works to fulfill their own motivations. As another chapter closes on China's blitz into modernity, one can only wonder how things will go from here.